The gates of the Ashworth estate had never opened for a man like Caleb Rourke before. Evelyn Ashworth stood with her back straight and her chin lifted, the way she always did when the world needed reminding of who held the power. Behind her, the household staff and half the extended family had gathered, drawn by whispers that had spread through the estate since dawn. They watched from a respectful distance, close enough to see, far enough to pretend they hadn't heard everything. "You understand the terms," Evelyn said, not quite a question. Caleb nodded once. His duffel bag hung heavy on his shoulder, the strap frayed at the edges from years of use. His boots were caked with dust from a road that had led him nowhere good for a long time. He didn't look like a man who belonged anywhere near marble columns and manicured hedges, and he knew it. "I understand," he said. Beside Evelyn, Grace stood in a slip of ivory silk that had been chosen for her that morning by someone else's hands. She hadn't picked the dress. She hadn't picked any of this. Her fingers trembled slightly as Caleb's rough hand closed around hers, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if the weight of what was happening needed a second to settle into their bones. "Grace," Evelyn said, her voice softer now, though not gentle. "This is what your father wanted. Before he passed, he made it clear. The inheritance stays protected only if you marry within the year, and marry someone who will not challenge the family's affairs." That was the truth of it, dressed up in legal language and delivered by lawyers in gray suits. Grace's father had built an empire, and in his final months, fear had made him cautious. He worried about fortune hunters circling his daughter, men from their own social circles who saw her as a means to an end. So he'd left behind a strange, almost cruel provision. Grace would marry a man of Evelyn's choosing, someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose by crossing the family, someone too poor and too proud to ever try to control the Ashworth fortune. Evelyn had found Caleb 3 towns over, working construction on a bridge that paid barely enough to keep him fed. A single father, raising his young son alone since his wife died 2 winters back. A man with calloused hands, a quiet temper, and absolutely nothing that could tempt him toward greed, or so Evelyn believed. She'd made him an offer that sounded, on paper, like charity. Marry Grace, live on the estate grounds, receive a modest stipend, and stay out of family matters entirely. In exchange, his son would have a roof that didn't leak and a future that didn't depend on the next paycheck. Caleb had said yes for his son. That was the only reason that mattered to him. Grace had said yes because she had no other options left, and because some quiet part of her, tired of the calculated men in her own world, wondered if a stranger with nothing to gain might be safer than all of them combined. Neither of them expected to feel anything as their hands touched at the gate. But something passed between them anyway. Not love, not yet, but a recognition. 2 people who had both been used as instruments by people who claimed to love them, standing at the threshold of a life neither had chosen, and finding, unexpectedly, that they weren't alone in it. "Take care of her," Evelyn said to Caleb, though her eyes carried a warning more than a blessing. "I intend to," Caleb answered, and for the first time, something in his voice made even Evelyn pause. The staff exchanged glances. The family members whispered behind gloved hands. None of them believed this marriage would last more than a season. A broke drifter and an heiress, bound together by a dead man's will and a scheming stepmother's calculations. It read like a joke that would end the moment the money ran dry or the novelty wore off. They had no idea how wrong they were. The first weeks were quiet, careful things. Caleb moved into the small cottage at the edge of the estate grounds with his 6-year-old son, Owen, a boy with his father's serious eyes and a habit of watching everything before he spoke. Grace visited them cautiously at first, unsure of her place in a home that wasn't the mansion she'd grown up in, but wasn't quite a stranger's house either. It was Owen who broke the ice. He'd found Grace sitting alone on the cottage porch one evening, staring out at the hills, and without a word, he'd climbed up beside her and handed her a smooth river stone he'd been carrying in his pocket. "It's my lucky one," he said. "You look like you need it more than me today." Grace had laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh, surprised out of her. From that evening on, something between the 3 of them began to shift. Caleb was not what Grace had expected. He didn't fawn over the estate or ask questions about the family fortune. He fixed the cottage's leaking roof himself, taught Owen to fish in the creek that ran along the property line, and treated Grace with a careful, unassuming respect that felt entirely foreign after a lifetime of men who wanted something from her. He asked nothing of her except her company, and even that, only when she offered it freely. Evelyn watched all of this from a distance, and her satisfaction slowly curdled into something like unease. This wasn't going the way she'd planned. Caleb was supposed to remain a background figure, grateful and compliant, easily managed. Instead, Grace was spending her evenings at the cottage instead of the mansion. She was laughing again. She was, Evelyn realized with growing alarm, falling in love with a man she'd handpicked specifically because she assumed no one could ever love him. It was 3 months into the marriage when the truth began to surface, and it arrived not through Caleb himself, but through a stranger who showed up at the estate gates asking for him by a different name. "Rourke isn't his name," the man said, when the guards finally let him speak with Evelyn. "Not really. His name is Caleb Ashford. His father built half the shipping routes on the eastern coast before he died. Caleb walked away from all of it 7 years ago, after his wife passed. Said he didn't want the money touching his son's life the way it touched his own childhood. Been hiding out in construction jobs ever since, using his mother's maiden name." Evelyn sat very still, the color draining slowly from her face as the pieces rearranged themselves into a shape she never could have predicted. She had chosen Caleb precisely because he had nothing. No name, no fortune, no leverage. She had wanted a man too small to ever challenge the family. Instead, she had unknowingly handed her stepdaughter to a man from a dynasty that dwarfed the Ashworths, a man who had simply chosen, of his own will, to live without any of it. The revelation reached Grace before Evelyn could decide how to control it. Caleb told her himself, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table in the cottage, Owen already asleep in the next room. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly. "I didn't want you to look at me differently. I didn't marry you for what your family has. I never wanted any of that, not from my own family, not from yours." Grace studied his face for a long moment, searching for the deception she'd been trained her whole life to expect from people who wanted something from her. She found none of it. Only a tired honesty, and underneath it, a fear that she might leave now that she knew who he really was. "I already knew who you were," she said finally. "Not your name. Not your money. I knew you were a good father, and a decent man, and that you never once made me feel like an asset to be managed. That's who you are to me, Caleb. That hasn't changed." Outside, on the estate grounds, Evelyn Ashworth stood at her window, watching the small light glowing in the cottage window, understanding at last that the plan she'd engineered so carefully had produced the one outcome she never accounted for. A marriage that was no longer a transaction, built by two people who had found something real in the wreckage of everyone else's expectations. She had given her stepdaughter away, thinking she was handing her to a man with nothing. She had no idea she was handing her to a man who had everything that mattered, and had simply chosen, all along, to keep it quiet.